The wheat below should have been moving with the wind. I knew the gust speed because I just fought it on the turn, hard enough that the left wing wanted to float and the hopper sloshed against its baffles. Dust was running along the county road in long tan streaks. The center pivot tracks were throwing little ghosts of dirt into the air. Everything on the ground said the Panhandle was taking a beating that afternoon. Except one field. Sat dead still. Not flattened. Not sheltered. Still. Thousands of acres of wheat holding perfectly upright while a strip no wider than a farm road shivered through the middle of it like something underneath had rolled over in its sleep. Then the cold hit. At 800 feet above sun-baked ground, I flew through a pocket of air so sudden and sharp it felt like opening a freezer. My headset crackled. Not from the radio. I had the transmit switch off. It still crackled, dry and insect-like against my ears. I banked left to keep clear of the motionless acreage, and that's when I saw the other plane. Another crop duster, yellow body, dark wings, flying parallel to me less than 100 yards off my right side. Same altitude, same heading. I could almost make out the smear of bugs on the leading edge. I called center anyway. My mouth had gone dry enough that I tasted dust. They came back after a pause and told me there wasn't another aircraft anywhere near my sector. The second plane turned when I turned. Then my radio, still switched off, said my tail number in my own voice. Why did men who'd spent their whole lives in the air act like a still field was worse than another airplane in their lane? That was 19 days before harvest. When I first drove into Dallam County, I thought I'd gotten lucky. That was the simple version. The version I still wish had been true. I was a contract AG pilot. Seasonal work, mostly. Herbicide, fungicide, the occasional late insect run when the price was right and the weather held. I'd taken jobs in Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, and one ugly stretch outside Clovis where the runway looked like it had been paved with broken dinner plates. I wasn't green. I knew low-altitude work. I knew what heat did to a turbine and what fatigue did to judgment. I knew how fast a field could stop being ordinary if a wire crossed it where a wire hadn't been the day before. What I didn't know was why a crop dusting outfit in the Panhandle would pay almost double market for a short contract and barely ask me anything before hiring me. The office sat beside a private strip cut out of hard dirt and caliche, with 2 metal hangars and a fuel tank farm behind a chain-link fence. The place smelled like avgas, hydraulic fluid, and baked weeds. Normal. Then a gust came through the yard carrying the smell of wet earth, dark and rich like a fresh ditch after rain. There hadn't been rain in weeks. I stopped with my hand on the truck door and looked up at the sky, like maybe I'd missed a storm cell on the drive-in. There wasn't a cloud worth naming. Inside the office, the air conditioner rattled in the window. A map of county parcels covered one wall. Another wall held framed photos of spray planes going back farther than I expected. Different paint jobs. Different decades. Same company name. Jebediah Wayne Cates met me at the desk with a clipboard already in his hand. He was lean, sun-cooked, and old in the way some men out there get old, not soft, just dried down to the parts that still worked. He shook once, firm, and looked at me like he was comparing me to something he'd measured before. "Colby Dean Runnels," he said. "You read what I give you, you do exactly what it says, and we'll get along fine." I figured he meant drift limits, neighbor complaints, no-fly houses, all the usual local rules. I said that was fine by me. He slid a single page across the desk. At the top it said route guidance for first week operations. Under that, for lines. Never fly directly over a motionless field. Do not make a second pass over marked acreage. Ignore structures visible from the air but absent from maps. Land immediately if the radio begins repeating your tail number. I read it twice. The paper smelled faintly musty, like it had been kept in a box with old invoices. I looked up at him and waited for the joke to show on his face. Didn't. "What's this supposed to be?" I asked. "Some local superstition packet?" "It's procedure," Jebediah Wayne Cates said. "For what?" "For here." That was all he gave me. I heard boots on the concrete behind me. Travis Lee Holloway had come in from the hangar with a helmet bag over one shoulder and a fuel slip in his hand. He was younger than me by a few years, maybe, but he had that same compact look most AG pilots get after enough seasons, like every extra motion has been sanded out of them. He nodded at the sheet. "You'll want that in your pocket," he said. "Not in the plane. On you." "Why?" He looked at Jebediah Wayne Cates before he answered. "Because if you have to leave the plane fast," Travis Lee Holloway said, "you won't want to be trying to remember it from memory." I laughed, because that still sounded like dry local nonsense and I didn't know what else to do with it. Neither one of them laughed back. Out by the loading area, a couple of the other pilots I wasn't introduced to were checking spray booms and talking low. Every one of them had the same folded paper tucked into a shirt pocket or under a cap band. Nobody treated it like a joke. Nobody treated it like a charm, either. More like a checklist they wished they didn't need. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the usual start of contract routine. Weight and balance, chemical handling, field assignments, emergency landing options, strip conditions, winds, water hazards, power lines, the ordinary kind of danger, the kind that stays deadly whether you respect it or not. Jebediah Wayne Cates was sharp on all of it. He wasn't sloppy. That made the paper harder to dismiss, not easier. At sunset he walked me out to the plane I'd be flying, ran a hand over the cowling like he was checking temperature through the paint, and said, "You don't get paid here to understand everything. You get paid to keep your route." I always keep my route. He looked out toward the wheat, where the evening light had gone copper and flat. "I know," he said. "That's why you're here." That line stayed with me. At the time, I took it as manager talk. Maybe he'd checked references. Maybe somebody I'd flown for had said I was steady under pressure. I didn't know then how badly that sentence would sour in my memory. That first night, I slept in the little bunkhouse behind the office. The swamp cooler clicked and hissed. Dry air came through it smelling faintly of dust and old metal. Around midnight I woke to a burst of static in my room. Sharp enough that I sat up thinking I'd left my handheld on. It was dead on the table across from the bed. Power off. Battery in. The static kept going for another 2 seconds, then cut clean. I lay there listening to my own breathing and told myself old wiring could make a lot of noises if you gave it enough time. Harvest was 48 days away. The first field I marked should have been routine. It was an early fungicide run. Not much wind yet. The kind of clean morning every AG pilot wants before the thermals start punching holes in your assumptions. The sun had just cleared the horizon enough to throw long shadows from the irrigation rigs. My light bar was behaving. The engine sounded healthy. The wheat below had that brushed look healthy wheat gets in low light, every row taking color a little differently. Then I crossed into one section and the whole pattern broke. I smelled wet dirt first. It came through the vents and under the chemical sting in the cockpit, cold and loamy, like I'd dropped a wheel into a creek bank. I glanced at the temperature probe. It shouldn't have mattered that low and that fast, but I watched it anyway. The number twitched down. Not much. Enough. Ahead of me, a square of wheat sat perfectly still. Wind was moving everything around it. I could see the gust lines touching one field, then the next. The motion carried cleanly across a fence line, skipped that square as if the air had gone around it, then picked up again on the far side. There were no shelter belts, no terrain break, no reason. My first stupid thought was irrigation. Maybe the plants were heavy and damp. Then I saw the shadows. They were wrong. At that hour every shadow in those fields leaned long and west, all of them agreeing with the sun behind me. This one field threw a second set of dark lines across itself at an angle that didn't belong to anything above ground. They weren't cloud shadows. The sky was empty. They looked more like the field was lit by something else under the horizon, from a direction the day wasn't using. I remembered the sheet in my shirt pocket. Never fly directly over a motionless field. So I offset the pass and kept my wheels clear of the center of it. I felt ridiculous doing it. I also felt relieved once I was past it, which I liked even less. After the run, I circled high enough to take another look. From there I saw a second problem. The parcel was too big. I knew the county grid well enough after 1 week of flying it. Quarter sections line up the way your own hands do after enough time. Familiar without thought. But the still field below was spilling past its boundary in the air. Not visibly, not like the crop crossed the fence on the ground. It was more that the space it occupied from above was larger than the surveyed box it sat inside. The corners weren't where they should have been. The field held more distance than the map had assigned it. That sounds insane said out loud. I know it does. At the time I blamed altitude, angle, fatigue, all the things a pilot is supposed to blame before he starts blaming the world. I marked the section number on my kneeboard anyway. 2 days later, I found another one. Same stillness. Same wet earth smell. Same sudden cold. This one wasn't oversized, but the rows inside it looked subtly bent. Not by equipment, not by wind. More like the ground underneath had once been folded and the wheat had grown along that old shape without asking whether the surface was flat now. By the end of the week, I had 4 sections in a notebook I'd started keeping in my duffel, each with notes on wind, time, and what I'd seen from what heading. When I brought it up to Jebediah Cates, he didn't tell me I was wrong. That would have been easier. He looked at the notebook, closed it with 2 fingers, and pushed it back to me. If you're going to write things down, he said, don't write coordinates. Why not? Because coordinates invite confidence. That answer irritated me enough that I forgot to be careful. One of those fields is bigger in the air than it is on the county plat. He nodded once, like I'd told him the fuel truck needed a tire. Then don't trust the plat from the air. You're saying that like it makes sense. It makes sense here. That was becoming his favorite phrase, and I was getting tired of it. I tried Travis Lee Holloway next. We were both at the nurse tank after lunch, rinsing chemical residue off the booms. The hose water hit the hot aluminum and turned to steam that smelled faintly metallic. You ever seen one of those fields lock up in the wind? I asked him. Like the whole section forgot how air works? He didn't answer right away. He shut the water off first. Before noon or after? Before. He nodded like that mattered. What difference does that make? He looked out over the runway, not at me. More than you'd think, he said. That was the first time I understood 2 things at once. 1, the rule sheet wasn't superstition. 2, nobody there intended to explain it in a straight line. Looking back, that was the last easy chance I had to pack the truck, leave the keys, and drive south until the land started making sense again. Instead, I flew the afternoon block. There were 40 days until harvest. The second sheet showed up at the start of the next week. Jebediah Cates handed it over without comment. Same paper stock, same plain heading, same 4 lines arranged like common sense had simply changed its mind over the weekend. Motionless fields are safe before noon. A second pass is required if the crop rows change direction. Map structures are less trustworthy than unmapped structures. Do not answer radio transmissions using your own voice. I read the first line 3 times and felt heat rise into my face. You told me the opposite last week. I told you what applied last week. I turned to Travis Lee Holloway, because he'd been standing in the doorway listening. You seeing this? He didn't look surprised at all. That bothered me more than the paper. What do your rules say? I asked him. He took his folded sheet out and held it, but didn't hand it over. My West blocks still carry the first set. So yours say stay off motionless fields. Mine say they're safe. Before noon, he said. That's not better. No, he said quietly. It usually isn't. That should have pushed me into open refusal. It should have made me demand a real explanation or walk. Instead, it did something worse. It made me curious in the way dangerous places count on. I wanted to know why 2 experienced pilots could be given opposite instructions and still talk like both sets were keeping them alive. The answer started arriving 1 piece at a time. Late that morning, I was working a narrow run along the north side of a parcel I'd marked earlier in the week, one of the bigger ones with the bent rows. At first it looked ordinary. Wind moving through it. Sun angle right. No wet earth smell. Then halfway down the pass, the rows below me changed direction. Not all at once. Not like somebody had cut a diagonal through the field. More like a current moved through the wheat and turned the pattern inside it by degrees until the lines I'd been using to hold my course were no longer parallel to the nose of the plane. I pulled up, climbed, and came around. Second rule. A second pass is required if the crop rows change direction. So I made it. On the first pass, the field had felt wrong. On the second pass, it felt settled. like I'd matched something I hadn't known was moving. The cold pocket I'd hit on entry was gone. The pressure in the cockpit eased enough that I noticed I'd been clenching my jaw. Back on the strip, Travis Lee Holloway listened without interrupting. Then he told me one of his own. He'd been flying a marked acreage west of ours 2 mornings earlier. His sheet still said no second pass. Mid-run, a tree line appeared along the southern edge of the field, just there all at once, casting sharp little shadows across ground that hadn't had trees on it when he loaded out. If he'd turned back for a second run, he said, he'd have crossed directly over a structure that wasn't on any map and hadn't been there the day before. What structure? I asked. He rubbed a thumb over the edge of his rule sheet. Looked like a grain elevator, he said. Too old. Wrong shape. Like something from a black and white county archive photo. So your wrong choice keeps you alive on your route, and mine keeps me alive on mine. He gave a small shrug. Seems that way. We stood there with chemical stink drying on our clothes, both of us trying to decide whether the other man was being played or whether the ground had somehow divided us into different kinds of truth. That afternoon I got my answer from the radio. I was on final approach to a low block east of the strip, descending through rough hot air that kept lifting one wing and dropping the other. The headset was quiet except for the usual hiss. Then it crackled hard enough to make me wince. Colby Dean Runnels, you copy? My own voice. Not similar. Not close. Mine. Same flat West Texas vowels. Same little rasp I get after too much dust. I froze with my hand already moving toward the transmit switch. Do not answer radio transmissions using your own voice. I took my thumb off the switch and forced myself to keep the nose level. The headset crackled again. Colby Dean Runnels, you copy? This time it sounded impatient. Like I was the one being difficult. My mouth had gone cold. I looked at the radio stack. Everything looked normal. Frequency right. Volume right. No fault lights. I reached over and turned the set off anyway. The voice came through one more time in the burst of power down static. Then it stopped. I finished the run, came back, and shut down harder than I meant to. When I climbed out, Travis Lee Holloway was already walking toward me across the ramp. You heard it, he said. I didn't ask how he knew. What happens if you answer? He squinted past me at the empty cockpit. I don't know, he said. Nobody who's answered has ever explained it in a way I believed. That detail seemed minor then. Just another bad piece in a strange pile. I have thought about it every day since. 32 days until harvest. The dust storm came in hard from the north and turned noon into dusk. Out there, storms don't ask permission. They just arrive and teach you how little shape the world needs to keep pretending to be stable. By early afternoon, the strip was getting sandblasted. Fine grit clicked against the office windows. The hangar doors boomed in their tracks. Every surface tasted alkaline. We grounded the planes and waited it out with towels under the door seams. The storm lasted most of the day and half the night. By morning the sky had gone clean and sharp again, blue enough to hurt, but the air still smelled wrong. Not just dust. Wet soil underneath it, as if a layer had been turned over somewhere miles wide and a few feet deep. We started finding changes before breakfast was cold. A farm road I had driven twice that week now bent around a dry tank that hadn't been there before. Fence lines still connected at both ends, but the middle distance had stretched to make room for something else. A row of utility poles reached a turn that no longer matched the county map on Jebediah Wayne Cates's wall. One section of wheat looked from the ground like it had been cut early, pale and low and uneven, but from the air it stood shoulder high and green. False harvest. That was what Travis Lee Holloway called it when we met back at the strip. He said it quietly, like he didn't want the phrase getting comfortable. That same afternoon I saw the first structure that taught me why the rules had split mapped from unmapped. I was flying low over a block near the western boundary when a barn appeared off my left wing. Close enough I jerked the stick before I thought about it. Silver roof. Long shadow. Stock tank beside it. Beyond that, an irrigation pivot turning slowly over bare earth. The whole setup looked real enough that I could have sworn I'd seen tire tracks leading to it. When I climbed and circled, it stayed there. When I marked the location and came back with the truck an hour later, There was nothing on the ground except wind-pressed grass and a rusted length of pipe half buried in caliche. The smell was strongest there. Wet, black dirt in full sun. On the way back, I stopped at a rise and looked over the section through binoculars. Nothing. No barn. No pivot. No stock tank. Just open ground. The next morning, company aerial photographs came in from a survey pass we'd made before the storm. We spread them across the office table. My fingers came away with dust from the paper sleeves. On one set of images, there was a silo near the eastern roads. Tall, white, clean-sided, throwing a narrow shadow into the wheat. It showed up in every frame that covered that area, no matter the angle. None of us could remember seeing it from the ground. So we drove out there. Jebediah Wayne Cates took the county map. Travis Lee Holloway drove. I rode with the photographs in my lap, matching road cuts and fence corners as we went. The farther we got, the less the paper wanted to line up with what the truck saw through the windshield. Gates came sooner than they should have. A windmill sat half a section north of where the photo put it. By the time we reached the place where the silo should have been, we were parked in the middle of a bare field entrance looking at open land and a line of wheat bending in steady wind. No silo, no slab, no utility hookup, no tire marks. But in the photo it stood there plain as daylight. Travis Lee Holloway took one of the prints and held it up against the real horizon, moving it back and forth until the edges of his hand shook. "It doesn't miss the shadow," he said. "If it was an artifact, it'd miss the shadow." Jebediah Wayne Cates took the photo back from him too fast. "We don't use survey images for ground confirmation after a storm," he said. That answer was so thin it almost made me laugh. Instead, I looked across the field and got a crawling sensation at the base of my neck. The kind that tells you you've overlooked something basic. Then I realized what it was. In the photograph, the silo wasn't standing inside the field. The field was arranged around it. That was the first time I considered that the oddities weren't being placed in the farmland. The farmland might be settling around something older, trying and failing to cover it cleanly. I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. It sounded too big, and I was still trying to keep the world small enough to handle. 25 days until harvest. Jebediah Wayne Cates gave us the safe explanation on a Monday morning, while the heat was still low and the office coffee tasted burned. He called me in before first load, closed the door, and set a folder on the desk between us. Inside were weather summaries, thermal reports, notes about dust refraction, a couple of photocopied articles on low-altitude visual distortion, mirage effects, atmospheric lensing, surface heat variance over irrigated and non-irrigated parcels. He walked me through it in the same level voice he'd use for pump pressure or nozzle size. "You're flying close to the ground in unstable summer air," he said. "You know what that does to perception. Add dust, add fatigue, add reflected light off crop tops, and you'll swear you saw things that don't hold up on foot. What about the photographs? Camera artifacts, angle, light scatter. What about the radio?" He didn't blink. "Crossfeed, induction, bad shielding." Everything he said had just enough truth inside it to hook into. That's what made it dangerous. He wasn't asking me to believe magic. He was offering a way to stay sane and keep working, and part of me wanted that badly enough to help him sell it. For several days I took it. Operations went normal. Boring even. Good spray windows. Clean runs. No still fields on my routes. No phantom buildings. No cold pockets sharp enough to notice. I slept. Ate. I started feeling embarrassed about the notebook in my duffel, like it belonged to a different version of me. One I could still outgrow if I acted right. That calm was a trap, and I stepped into it willingly. On the 4th day of normal, we got a fresh set of aerial photographs. These weren't storm leftovers. These were current, clean, and shot in stable air. I knew the route because I had flown part of it myself. We laid the prints out on the table under the office fan. The paper edges fluttered. Dust had worked into the corners of the room, into the grain of the desk, into the cups stacked by the sink. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Then I saw a creek. Not a dry wash, not a drainage scar. A creek, dark and narrow, with a cut bank on one side and a line of greener growth tracking it across 3 sections of farmland. The only problem was there had never been a creek there. No old bed. No recorded flood path. No culvert crossing those roads. Nothing. Another print showed a loop of road circling an empty patch where no county road existed. Another showed the white silo again, in a different position relative to the fields around it. Same shadow. Same dimensions. Different place. And in the far corner of one frame, half covered by glare, sat a cluster of low structures I would have sworn were grain bins and a fuel shed. They were arranged exactly where the false barn and pivot had appeared from the air. I remember the room getting very quiet around that table. Even the fans seemed to drop out for a second. Travis Lee Holloway touched the edge of the creek image with one fingernail. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said. Jebediah Wayne Cates didn't answer. That silence broke the safe explanation worse than any confession could have. If he'd argued, I might have argued back. If he'd lied harder, I might have chosen a lie. Instead, he just stood there with both hands flat on the desk, looking down at the photographs like a man watching a wound reopen exactly where he'd stitched it before. At the time, I thought the worst part was learning he'd known more than he told us. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing the land itself was producing evidence faster than any human explanation could bury it. 19 days until harvest. The third sheet came in the second week of August, and by then I was done pretending each new page was separate from the one before. The fields have started moving. Trust yesterday's rules only if yesterday still happened. Count the silos before every flight. If there are more silos than expected, stay airborne. I read that line about yesterday twice and felt a slow numbness spread through my hands. How do I know if yesterday still happened? Jebediah Wayne Cates gave me a look I'd come to recognize. Not pity. Worse. Familiarity. "You compare notes before you start the engine," he said. That morning the GPS drifted so badly on startup that my field boundaries looked like they were sliding under the icon. By lunch, 2 parcels on my handwritten route map no longer matched the road grid outside the windshield. One had rotated just enough that my entry line was wrong. Another had somehow gained distance on its southern edge. Not visible from the ground. Visible from low altitude, where my working life happened and where the lie was thinning. We stopped trusting the digital maps. Every evening Jebediah Wayne Cates updated paper copies by hand at the office table, pencil first, then red pen once he was sure the change would hold until dawn. He made Travis Lee Holloway and me sign the bottom corner after reviewing them, like the act of reading could anchor a route in place for one more day. That was when I found the journals. They were in a locked cabinet in the back room behind old chemical invoices and maintenance binders, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled like dust and dead paper. I found them because I was looking for my own employment paperwork. That had started with a simple irritation. I wanted to know who had referred me. Jebediah Wayne Cates kept dodging the question, and the line he'd used on my first day kept working under my skin. "That's why you're here." I wanted something concrete. A former boss. A recommendation letter. A reason. My hiring file was in the drawer under current contracts. It was complete. Application, certifications, insurance copy, tax paperwork, signature pages. The problem was the dates. They were mine. My handwriting. My initials. My signature. All of it. And the application had been processed months before I ever submitted it. I stared at that page long enough for the room to go hot around me. I remembered filling it out in late summer, in my apartment with the television on low and a grocery list under my elbow. But the top of the form carried a spring date. The approval stamp was earlier still. Attached to it was a route briefing memo assigning me to Panhandle blocks before I had even called about the job. I went cold all over. That was contamination, though I didn't have that word for it yet. Not chemicals. Not disease. Alignment. My memory and the paperwork were no longer living on the same version of the timeline, and the land below was starting to decide which one counted. Under my file sat the journals. Some belonged to pilots from the middle of the last century, when the company ran smaller planes and more guesswork. Before that, the records changed shape. Survey notes, boundary logs, ranch ledgers, hand-drawn plats with corrections layered over corrections until the paper looked scabbed. The oldest entries weren't from crop dusters at all. They were from men trying to mark ground that wouldn't hold still long enough to be named. Every generation had its own language for what was happening. Air pockets, fold land, false drainage, the underneath. But the pattern was the same. The anomalies grew worse as harvest approached. Fields changed first, then roads, then structures, then, if containment failed, whole sections of visible geography peeled back and something older asserted its shape through them. Every account turned urgent near harvest. Every account lost people near harvest. I sat on the floor between those cabinets with the smell of moldy paper and fertilizer dust in my nose, turning pages with hands that didn't feel attached to me. One entry from the 1930s described a line of grain bins appearing overnight and remaining visible only from horseback at dawn. Another from the 1970s mentioned radio calls answered in the pilot's own voice. A maintenance log from the 1990s listed 3 planes launched not to spray for pests, but to seal northern edge before cut. Seal. Not treat. Not cover. Seal. When Travis Lee Holloway found me back there, I handed him my file without a word. He read the date and went pale under the dust on his face. "You sure this is yours? I know my signature." He took a long breath through his nose, as if he was bracing against a smell that hadn't reached me yet. "My first sheet was already in my mailbox when I got here," he said. "I figured Jebediah Wayne Cates was just organized." We stood there in that cramped room with history stacked around us, and I understood something simple and ugly. The company hadn't built rules because the land was strange. The company existed because the land was strange, and every rule was just a field repair passed down until somebody could survive long enough to write the next one. 12 days until harvest. I found the coordinates hidden in the flight records because I stopped reading them like pilot logs and started reading them like map corrections. Old route sheets had tiny heading changes written in the margins, not enough to matter for drift control, not enough to explain on performance alone. But when I laid enough of them side by side from different years, the adjustments sketched a shape. Not a route. Convergence. Jebediah Wayne Cates had known where it pointed. Maybe he thought I wasn't ready. Maybe he thought nobody was. It didn't matter by then. I loaded early, took a lighter chemical mix than my ticket called for, and flew before sunrise while the air still held the night's leftover chill. Even then I smelled wet earth. The coordinates led toward a patch of central acreage I'd overflown twice before without noticing anything except a few awkward field boundaries and a dry road that never seemed to cast a consistent shadow. From altitude it looked harmless. From working height it began to separate. First the wind vanished. Not outside the plane. Outside the fields. My wings still buffeted in moving air. But below me the wheat stopped responding in connected ways. One parcel rippled north to south. The next held still. A third moved in circles around a point I couldn't see. The sunlight on the crop tops lost its smoothness and broke into plains. Like the land was no longer one surface but many laid over each other badly. Then the cold spread. Not a pocket this time. A whole zone. My hands stiffened on the stick. The cockpit glass fogged faintly at the corners and cleared again. Static burst through the headset in pulses even with the radio dead. Between those bursts I could hear something else, low and distant, like water moving under a floor. I reached the center of the coordinates and looked down. Texas was gone. Not literally. The roads, fields, and section lines were still there, but they had become the thinnest visible layer, a skin stretched over something far larger that was showing through at the seams. Beneath the farmland, not underground exactly but through it, I could see geometric bands running for miles in impossible alignment. Angles too clean to be natural and too broad to be man-made in any ordinary sense. Vast terraces, dry channels, repeating shapes that linked fields which had no business relating to each other. A river crossed under me flowing uphill relative to the county grade. Another split into 3 branches that met again without changing elevation. The ghost structures we'd been seeing weren't random. They sat at fixed points along that older pattern, like anchor marks from a layout that had once governed the whole plain. The still fields weren't dead zones. They were windows where the covering layer had gone thin. The wrong shadows came from edges in the underneath. The oversized acreage existed because the older geography carried more space through a section than the current survey allowed. I banked wider and saw the scale of it. This wasn't one bad parcel. It wasn't a weather effect or a haunted farm or any small story my mind could use to defend itself. The Panhandle itself sat over a landscape that followed different spatial rules, and at certain times of year, when growth and heat and timing aligned, the ordinary farmland above it lost its grip. That was why the anomalies were visible only from low altitude. Ground level trapped you inside whichever version had taken hold around your feet. From the air, just low enough to read the land but high enough not to belong to it, you could see the overlap. I didn't understand everything yet, but I understood enough to be afraid in a way that had nothing to do with panic. Professionals like me spend our lives trusting that if something behaves strangely, close observation will reduce it to a problem. That day was when I learned observation could also enlarge a thing until it left no room for you at all. When I turned for home, the route back didn't line up with the route in. A road had shifted east. A windmill was gone. In its place stood 3 white silos where yesterday I would have sworn there had only been 2. I stayed airborne. 6 days until harvest. The morning harvest started. The whole yard smelled like rain on plowed ground. There was no rain. The sky was clear enough to cut on. But the air around the strip held that damp, black soil smell so strongly it coated the back of my throat. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. Every man there moved fast and quiet. No wasted talk. As if we'd rehearsed this for years. Maybe they had. Jebediah Waincates met us at the loading area with hand-marked route sheets. 1 for me, 1 for Travis Lee Holloway, 1 for each of the other pilots. No chemical discussion beyond tank level and release timing. No agronomy. No pest pressure. Just lines, turn points, headings, and a start order. I looked at the mix in the tank and knew on sight it wasn't about crop treatment. Too thin. Too inconsistent. Token load. Enough to justify the aircraft to anybody asking from outside. Not enough to explain the urgency. What are we actually spraying? I asked. Jebediah Waincates looked past me at the fields, where dawn light was sliding across the wheat in long bright panes. Doesn't matter, he said. It's the route that matters. Keep your wheels over the line, no matter what moves under you. That was the closest thing to honesty he'd given me. By first light we were airborne. From above, the Panhandle had started opening. It began at the field edges. Rows slipping out of alignment. Fence lines no longer agreeing with road ditches. Then larger motions. Whole parcels rotated by degrees while still touching their neighbors. Bands of color emerged through the wheat where no variety difference existed, dark green beside pale silver beside dry gold. Not in agricultural blocks but in broad old shapes that ignored ownership and machinery alike. The radio came alive with clipped position calls and static. More static than words. Sometimes the static carried names. Sometimes it carried tail numbers in the wrong voices. Nobody answered except in code and brief confirmations, never full speech unless they had to. My route took me along the northern boundary of the central blocks I'd seen separating days before. As I crossed the first marker point, the temperature dropped so hard my breath touched the inside of the mask. Beneath me the wheat flattened in a moving arc, not from downdraft. From the land changing shape. The chemical streamed out behind me in a pale fan that dispersed too quickly to mean much. But the line held. I saw it happen. A spreading discoloration in the field below, dark and wet-looking, stopped dead at the exact path of my pass as if the air itself had drawn a border the ground recognized. I pulled up at the end, turned, and made the next run. Another line, another halt, containment, not superstition, not ritual. Aircraft, flying precise low routes at the right moment of seasonal instability, were tracing boundaries the older landscape could not easily cross. The spray was cover. The motion was the work. And once I knew that, every rule snapped into place so cleanly it made me dizzy. Never fly directly over a motionless field, because some windows were too thin to cross safely. Do not make a second pass over marked acreage, because repeating a line where it had already sealed could weaken another edge. Then later, make the second pass if the rows changed direction, because the shift had moved the seam. Land if the radio repeated your tail number, because something inside the overlap was trying to get you to confirm position in a voice it could use. All of it was operational procedure. All of it had been written by people working on the skin of a place that wasn't ours. Ahead of me, to the west, Travis Lee Holloway's route started to fail. I saw it before anyone said it over the radio. A section of land just beyond his assigned line darkened and sank without sinking, if that makes sense. The wheat there didn't flatten. It receded, exposing a geometric channel underneath that ran at an angle through 3 farms and 1 county road. The air above it shimmered with cold. Travis Lee Holloway's sheet should have taken him away from it on the next turn. I knew because I'd memorized my route and enough of his to avoid crossing. Instead, he banked hard and came across toward my corridor. For one breath, I thought he'd lost orientation. Then his voice came over the radio, thin under the static. "I'm taking your line." Jebediah Wayne Cates shouted something I couldn't make out. Travis didn't answer. He dropped lower and flew the route printed on my sheet, not his wheels almost skimming the wheat. As he crossed the expanding dark channel, the change below slowed. Not all at once, like pressure being pushed back. The exposed shape under the field stopped widening. The county road on its edge, which had already begun to bend wrong, settled into one line again. He'd chosen the contradiction. His own rules had stopped working. Mine held. For that section, at that moment, I swung through my next turn and tried to reacquire him through the glare. He was there for 1 second, yellow fuselage bright in the morning sun, a little low, spray fan streaming behind him. Then a burst of static tore across every frequency so loud I flinched. When it cleared, the route below remained contained. Travis Lee Holloway was gone. No fire, no smoke, no impact scar, no call. Just absence, sharp and impossible. I wanted to break line and search. Every part of me wanted it. Training said finish the active hazard first, then look. Jebediah Wayne Cates's voice came through once, ragged and controlled. "Keep your route, Colby Dean Runnels. Keep your route." So I did. I flew until my shoulders burned and the tank ran dry and the whole visible landscape beneath us shuddered through one final realignment. Fields slid back over channels. Roads straightened where they could. The ghost structures thinned and collapsed into glare. By late afternoon, the older pattern had retreated below the farmland again. Not gone, just covered. The countdown was over. Harvest had come. Afterward, nobody could find Travis Lee Holloway's plane. That should have been impossible. We knew his fuel load. We knew his last heading. We had enough eyes in the air to bracket a search zone. We walked fields, drove roads, checked drainage cuts and fence lines, and every place a yellow fuselage should have flashed in the sun if it had gone down. Nothing. By evening, I went into the office and pulled the dispatch board. His route card was gone. I checked the flight logs. The morning launch list carried 1 fewer name than I remembered. I went to the cabinet for his employment file. Empty slot. No folder. I looked at Jebediah Wayne Cates across the room and saw, by the way he held still, that none of this surprised him enough. "Don't do that," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Try to use paper like it's stronger than the ground." That night I didn't sleep. The bunkhouse smelled of dust and damp soil together. The 2 scents layered like different seasons occupying the same room. Around midnight I heard static from the dead handheld again. And for 1 second I expected Travis Lee Holloway's voice. It wasn't his. It was mine, breathing. In the weeks after harvest, Jebediah Wayne Cates finally told me enough of the truth to make leaving difficult. Not easy. Difficult. The company had been there in one form or another for generations. Before spray planes, there had been survey crews, riders, boundarymen, whoever the era allowed. Agriculture hadn't created the problem. It had only provided a useful pattern over the top of it. Straight roads, repeatable parcels, seasonal coverage, aircraft that could draw lines quickly over unstable ground. Farming gave human beings a way to monitor the overlap. The overlap was the point. He never called it an entity, not out loud, but I came to think of it that way because it behaved less like a place than a system with preferences. The older landscape beneath the Panhandle wasn't invading. That had been my mistake. The land people thought was normal, the fields and roads and surveyed sections, was the temporary arrangement. Every season, reality settled over the underneath like dust over machinery. Most years it held. Some years it thinned. At harvest, when growth cycles turned and the land changed use all at once, the underneath pressed closest to the surface. We weren't protecting wheat from pests. We were maintaining a boundary between overlapping geographies so farms, towns, roads, and people could continue pretending one map was enough. That was the maximum size of the truth I could carry, and even then I had to keep turning it into smaller pieces to live with it. The motionless fields had been safe or unsafe depending on when the overlap was opening and from which direction it was being stressed. The false structures were fixed features of the older landscape appearing where the cover failed. The silo in the photographs belonged to the underneath, not the county. The rule changes weren't contradictions in the lazy sense. They were daily operational updates from people tracking a system that changed faster than language. And my paperwork. That one Jebediah Wayne Cates never answered cleanly. When I asked him why my contract file had been processed months before I applied, he stood at the map wall with a pencil in hand and said, "Some people arrive before they get here." That was all. I don't know whether he meant I had the kind of flying record they needed and they'd picked me out early. I don't know whether the paperwork had changed after the fact because my memory was already sliding. I don't know whether the land below had room for me in it long before I ever saw the job posting. That question stayed open, and maybe it always will. What I do know is that contamination doesn't stop when the season ends. Settles in. Months later, after the wheat had been cut and hauled and the fields were bare in patches and winter wheat was going in elsewhere, I was still there. I had told myself all season I'd leave after harvest. Get paid. Put distance between me and that strip. Find work where the ground was only the ground. Instead, I signed another contract. I told myself it was the money. I told myself I wanted proof that the worst of it only happened at harvest. I told myself a lot of things men tell themselves when staying feels more honest than admitting they no longer fit anywhere uncomplicated. The real truth was smaller and uglier. I could see it now. Not all of it. Not the full opening. But the hints. The subtle shifts in field edge alignment. The places where wind moved wrong. The way cold gathered over certain sections before the map changed. I counted silos without meaning to. I listened to dead radios. I noticed when a road's shadow no longer matched the ditch that cast it. Other people drove through and saw farmland. I saw the cover holding. Most mornings that was enough. A few months after harvest, I was up on a routine pass in clean weather with no reason to expect trouble. The sky was pale and empty. The engine note was steady. Dry dust trailed the section roads below in thin lines. Ordinary day. Ordinary work. Then I looked east over a block I'd flown the afternoon before and saw a river crossing the farmland. Not a wash. Not a flood scar. A river, narrow and dark, with a green margin on both sides and one bright cut where it crossed through a wheat stubble field. It hadn't been there the day before. I knew it hadn't. Nobody on the ground below was reacting. Tractors kept moving. Trucks kept to the roads. The cover was still good enough at ground level. I didn't feel surprised the way I used to. I smelled wet earth through the vents. I felt the temperature drop around the cockpit glass. Static whispered once in the headset, though the radio was off. Then I banked, marked the river's line against the section roads, and updated tomorrow's flight plan. Before I landed, I counted the silos again.